Cowboy saved an Apache woman 10 years ago. She returned saying marry her. His response shocked everyone. What could make someone return after 10 years with such an unexpected request? And what kind of response could leave everyone completely shocked? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you enjoy unforgettable Western stories filled with emotion, mystery, and timeless values, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thank you for being here and for supporting this channel with your time, your views, and your encouragement. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, what do you think would happen if someone returned after 10 years asking for marriage? Now, settle in, relax, and let us journey together into a remarkable tale from the American frontier. 300 Apache riders appeared at sunrise, yet not a single rifle was raised, not a single war cry echoed across the valley. And somehow that silence frightened the town more than any battle ever could. The first rays of morning stretched across the Wyoming prairie as Elias Carter tightened the worn leather strap around a weathered saddle that had served him for nearly 15 years. The wind carried the familiar scent of dry sage, old timber, and dust drifting across the empty fields where healthy cattle had once grazed. His ranch had become little more than a forgotten patch of land clinging to the edge of survival. The fence leaned in several places. The barn roof sagged beneath years of unforgiving winters. Even the old chestnut horse standing beside him seemed to move with the slow patience of something that had accepted life exactly as it was. Elias preferred it that way. Solitude asked for nothing. It judged no one. Every sunrise looked almost identical to the last, and that kind of quiet had become his closest companion. Then the birds disappeared. One moment meadowlarks danced across the fence posts. The next, the sky seemed strangely empty. His horse lifted its head before Elias heard it himself. Hoofbeats. Distant. Steady. Too many to count. He climbed onto the porch and shaded his eyes against the growing light. Far beyond the rolling hills, a cloud of pale dust stretched across nearly half a mile, moving with remarkable discipline instead of chaos. Whoever approached traveled together with purpose. Within minutes, the church bell in the nearby settlement began ringing. Storekeepers stepped outside. Children stopped playing. Ranch hands abandoned water buckets and gathered near the main road. Nobody spoke louder than a whisper because everyone could now see what was coming. Apache riders. Hundreds of them. They rode in perfect formation, each horse matching the pace of the next, as though the entire procession breathed with one heartbeat. Their blankets carried rich earth tones that glowed beneath the morning sun. Eagle feathers shifted gently in the breeze. Long shadows followed them across the valley floor. Yet no weapons pointed toward the town. No faces showed anger. They simply kept riding until they reached the open field directly in front of Elias Carter's broken ranch. Then every horse stopped at exactly the same moment. Dust drifted quietly around them before settling back onto the earth. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. At the front of the procession sat a woman wearing a turquoise necklace that caught the sunlight like running water. Her posture carried quiet authority instead of pride. Her dark hair rested over one shoulder, braided with silver beads that reflected every movement of the wind. She looked no older than 30, yet her eyes held the calm confidence of someone who had crossed deserts, winters, and impossible years without ever forgetting where she intended to go. She slowly dismounted, took 3 measured steps toward the porch, and looked directly at the lonely cowboy who seemed unable to remember how to breathe. When she finally spoke, her voice remained gentle enough for only the nearest people to hear, but every soul in the valley somehow understood every word. Elias Carter, she said with the faintest smile. I promised I would find you again. I have spent 10 years keeping that promise. Today, I have come to ask you to marry me. No one moved. Even the wind seemed unwilling to interrupt the moment that settled over the valley like morning fog. Elias remained on the porch with one hand resting lightly against the rough wooden railing, his weathered fingers tightening almost without thought. He studied the woman standing before him, searching for a face hidden somewhere beneath the years, but memory offered only fragments instead of certainty. There was something familiar in the way she stood without fear, something quietly patient in the way her eyes waited instead of demanding. Around them, the Apache riders remained perfectly still beside their horses, not as an army preparing for conflict, but as honored witnesses to something already decided long before this day arrived. The townspeople whispered among themselves from a cautious distance. Some recognized Elias only as the quiet rancher who rarely visited town except to buy flour, coffee, and horseshoes. Most had never heard him speak more than a few words at a time. Children often wondered why a man who had once owned one of the strongest ranches in the county now lived alone with barely enough cattle to fill a single pasture. They did not know that loss had a way of shrinking a man's world until silence became easier than conversation. Elias had buried his parents years earlier after a bitter winter took nearly everything they owned. Friends slowly moved away. Opportunities followed the railroad west. Marriage had never happened because every season brought another reason to wait until next year. And after enough years passed, waiting quietly became a habit that no longer felt lonely. Inside the small ranch house, little remained beyond necessity. A cast-iron stove stood beside a table polished smooth by time. One coffee cup rested near the window. One plate. One chair worn softer than the others. Above the fireplace hung an old leather rope that had belonged to his father, and beside it rested a faded map whose edges had curled from countless summers. Yet among all those ordinary belongings, one object had always stayed within reach. Hanging from a wooden peg near the front door was a simple, braided leather bracelet with a small turquoise bead tied into its center. The leather had darkened with age, but Elias had never thrown it away. He could not explain why. Whenever he looked at it, he felt the strange comfort of remembering something important without remembering what it actually was. More than once he had almost tossed it into the stove during spring cleaning, only to find himself placing it back on the same hook before sunset. Now, as the woman stood only a few yards away, her eyes drifted toward that bracelet through the open doorway. For the first time since arriving, the calm confidence on her face softened into something warmer. She smiled with quiet recognition, almost as though greeting an old friend who had faithfully guarded a promise without realizing it. Elias noticed the direction of her gaze and instinctively looked toward the bracelet himself. His heart began beating just a little faster. The morning suddenly felt smaller, the years somehow shorter. He searched her face once more, studying every detail that time had carefully reshaped. Then, without warning, he remembered a frightened pair of young eyes reflected in rushing water, a trembling hand pressing something into his palm before disappearing into rain and river mist. The memory lasted only a heartbeat before slipping away again, but it was enough to leave him standing perfectly still, wondering whether the forgotten past had finally found its way home. The braided bracelet suddenly felt heavier in Elias Carter's hand than it ever had before. His thumb slowly brushed across the faded turquoise bead, and with that single touch, the years that had quietly buried the memory began falling away like dry leaves before an autumn wind. 10 years earlier, the valley had looked nothing like this peaceful morning. Black storm clouds had swallowed the afternoon sky until daylight disappeared hours too soon. Rain struck the earth with relentless force, turning narrow creeks into wild rivers that tore through the canyons without mercy. Elias had been 28 then, riding home after searching nearly 15 miles for 3 missing calves scattered by the storm. Every sensible rancher would have turned toward shelter, but a distant cry drifted through the rain. It was not loud. In fact, the wind nearly carried it away before he heard it a second time. Without stopping to question why, he guided his horse toward the sound. The swollen river rushed between towering stone banks, its muddy water carrying broken branches, tangled brush, and entire tree trunks downstream. Near the edge of the current, a young Apache woman struggled to keep her footing as the soaked ground crumbled beneath her boots. She could not have been older than 19. Her horse had already disappeared somewhere beyond the flood, leaving only scattered hoofprints vanishing beneath rushing water. She looked exhausted rather than frightened, determined to fight the storm one careful step at a time. Then the river claimed the last solid ground beneath her feet. Elias reacted before fear had time to speak. He tied his horse to a sturdy cottonwood, wrapped one end of his rope around his waist, and secured the other to the thick trunk. The cold water struck him with enough force to steal his breath, but he kept moving until he reached the young woman. She fought the current with remarkable courage, yet exhaustion had already begun slowing her movements. Elias reached her just as another surge swept across the river. He caught her wrist firmly, careful not to frighten her, and together they struggled toward the rocky shoreline one step at a time. Neither spoke a single word. There was no need. Sometimes survival created its own language. By the time they reached dry ground, both of them sat quietly beneath the shelter of an overhanging cliff while rain continued pounding the valley around them. The young woman finally looked at him with steady brown eyes filled not with suspicion, but quiet gratitude. She removed a simple leather bracelet from her wrist, one decorated with a single turquoise bead no larger than a thumbnail, and gently placed it into his open palm. Elias shook his head with a tired smile. He had not expected payment for helping another traveler. She simply closed his fingers around the bracelet before speaking softly in careful English. Please keep it. One day it will remind one of us where to return. Before he could ask what she meant, distant voices echoed somewhere beyond the rain. She immediately stood, glanced toward the canyon, and offered one final grateful smile. Then she disappeared between the towering rocks as quietly as morning mist. Elias waited several minutes before returning to his horse, believing he had simply helped a stranger whose path would never cross his own again. He carried the bracelet home, hung it beside his front door, and over the years slowly forgot the face of the young woman. He remembered only the storm, the river, and the strange feeling that one unfinished promise had been left behind beneath the sound of falling rain. The memories settled gently between them, and for the first time in 10 years, neither of them needed the bracelet to remember why fate had brought them back together. Elias slowly lowered his hand, still holding the worn leather braid, while the morning breeze carried the scent of fresh pine and distant sage across the valley. The woman before him gave a respectful nod, as though she understood exactly what had returned to his heart. "You remember now," she said softly. Elias answered with a quiet smile that carried more humility than certainty. "I remember the storm," he replied. "I remember the river. I remember a young woman who was far braver than she believed." Her eyes shimmered with quiet warmth. "Her name is Iona Redhawk." The name settled over the gathering like the final piece of a story waiting years to be spoken aloud. Whispering spread through the crowd. Several older townspeople exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who knew little about the Apache recognized the family name. Redhawk had long been associated with respected leaders known for keeping peace whenever peace could still be found. Iona stepped aside and motioned toward the riders waiting silently behind her. One by one, the Apache men and women dismounted without haste. Instead of carrying gifts of gold or displays of wealth, they brought simple woven blankets, carefully carved cedar boxes, fresh baskets of dried fruit, and bundles of medicinal herbs gathered from distant mountains. Every offering was placed gently upon the grass before Elias's porch. There were no speeches, no demands, only quiet gratitude expressed through actions rather than words. The sight puzzled nearly everyone watching. The sheriff removed his hat. The blacksmith folded his arms in confusion. Mothers held their children's hands a little tighter, not out of fear now, but because they sensed they were witnessing something few people would ever see twice in a lifetime. Elias looked from the gifts back to Iona. "This is far more than anyone should give for a favor that lasted only a few minutes." She slowly shook her head. "You believe you rescued one frightened traveler. That is not the whole story." The valley grew silent again. Even the horses seemed unusually calm, standing without a single restless step. Iona walked toward the porch until only a few feet separated them. Her voice remained steady, but every word carried the weight of 10 patient years. "The day you found me, I was returning from visiting my grandfather, the chief of our people. He was already growing weak. Before I reached home, the storm came. Everyone believed the river had taken me away forever." Elias listened without interrupting. "When I finally returned 2 days later, carrying only the bracelet you refused to accept as payment, my grandfather asked who had saved my life. I told him about the quiet cowboy who expected nothing in return. He smiled and said that a man who asks for nothing often deserves the greatest honor." She glanced briefly toward the riders standing behind her. "Before he walked his final journey, he gave our family one promise to protect. He told us to find the man who valued a stranger's life more than his own comfort. He said that if I ever wished to build a family, I should first find the man whose heart chose kindness before pride." Elias lowered his eyes toward the weathered porch beneath his boots. The years of loneliness suddenly felt very different, as though every quiet sunrise had unknowingly been leading to this morning. Yet before he could answer, another sound drifted across the valley. More horses approached from the western road. This time they did not ride in careful silence. They came fast enough to scatter dust high into the brightening sky, and every face in the crowd slowly turned to see who had chosen this exact moment to arrive. The newcomers were not strangers. Every rancher in the valley recognized the polished wagons, the expensive horses, and the neatly tailored coats before anyone could make out the faces. At their head rode Charles Whitmore, the wealthiest cattle owner for 50 miles, accompanied by his son Benjamin and several respected businessmen from the county. Charles brought his horse to a slow stop a short distance from Elias's porch and studied the gathering with careful eyes. His expression revealed curiosity more than concern. He had known Elias for years, though never well. To most people, Elias Carter had become little more than a hard-working man whose fortunes had quietly faded while everyone else chased larger ranches and faster profits. Charles removed his hat with practiced courtesy. "It appears we have arrived in the middle of something important," he said. Before Elias could answer, Iona stepped forward with calm dignity. "You have arrived in the middle of a promise that has waited 10 years. Her voice carried no challenge, only simple truth. Benjamin glanced toward the blankets and cedar boxes spread neatly across the grass. He leaned toward his father and whispered something that caused several of the businessmen to exchange uncertain looks. They clearly expected negotiations over land, cattle, or trade. Instead, they found gifts resting before the porch of the poorest ranch in the valley. Charles looked back at Elias. "Would you care to explain what is happening?" Elias hesitated for a moment before quietly answering. "I do not believe I understand all of it myself." A faint smile crossed Iona's face. "Then perhaps it is time you did." She turned toward the Apache riders, and an elderly man with silver hair carefully stepped forward carrying a long cedar chest polished smooth by generations of careful hands. He placed it gently on the porch before Elias and stepped back without speaking. Iona slowly lifted the carved lid. Inside rested dozens of carefully folded papers protected beneath soft buckskin, alongside a beautifully crafted pipe, several turquoise ornaments, and a weathered journal bound in dark leather. She removed the journal with both hands, treating it with unmistakable respect. "My grandfather wrote in this until the final winter of his life," she said quietly. "After I returned safely, he devoted many pages to the man he had never met." Elias looked genuinely surprised. "He wrote about me?" She nodded. "Every season. He believed kindness deserved to be remembered, especially when no one asked to be remembered." She carefully opened the journal to a page marked by a faded ribbon. The handwriting flowed neatly across the paper. She read slowly, so everyone standing nearby could hear. "If my granddaughter ever finds the rancher again, tell him this. A man who rescues another without asking their name has already honored the Creator. If he remains unmarried and his heart is still free, he shall always have a place among our people, not because of debt, but because character creates stronger families than blood alone." Complete silence settled across the valley once again. Even Charles Whitmore lowered his eyes for a moment after hearing the old chief's words. Elias stared at the journal as though it belonged to someone else's story. He had spent 10 years believing that one rainy afternoon had disappeared into history. He had never imagined that somewhere beyond the mountains, an old chief had faithfully recorded his name while praying that their paths might someday cross again. Iona gently closed the journal and held it close to her heart. Then she met Elias's eyes with the same quiet certainty she had carried since arriving. "I did not spend 10 years searching because tradition demanded it," she said. "I searched because every page reminded me that the greatest promise my grandfather left behind was not written for me. It was written for you." Iona took one slow breath before stepping onto the first wooden stair leading to Elias's porch. Every eye in the valley followed her movement. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the weathered boards beneath her moccasins while a gentle breeze stirred the prairie grass around the gathered horses. She carried no crown, no weapon, and no symbol of power beyond the quiet confidence with which she walked. When she reached the porch, she stopped an arm's length from Elias and looked at him with the same calm expression she had worn beside the flooded river 10 years before. The old journal rested against her heart for one final moment before she carefully handed it to the elderly Apache beside her. Then she untied a narrow strip of turquoise cloth from her wrist. It was beautifully woven, its edges softened by years of careful handling. She placed it across both palms and held it toward Elias. "Among my people," she said gently, "a gift carried this long is never given by accident. It waits until the right day finds it." Elias looked at the cloth but did not reach for it. The silence between them grew so still that even the distant creaking of the windmill behind the barn sounded unusually loud. Iona smiled softly. "When I was 19, I believed surviving the storm was the greatest gift I had received. As I grew older, I understood that surviving was only the beginning. The greater gift was discovering that goodness can appear without asking your name, your family, or where you come from." She lowered herself onto one knee, not as an act of submission, but as a gesture of profound respect that caused quiet astonishment to ripple through both the Apache riders and the townspeople alike. Charles Whitmore instinctively removed his hat again. Several older women near the church covered their mouths in disbelief. Even Benjamin, who had arrived expecting a business dispute, stood speechless. Iona lifted her eyes toward Elias. "For 10 years I have crossed mountains, rivers, and deserts searching for the man who forgot the kindness that changed another life forever. I did not return because I owe you anything. Gratitude alone cannot carry a journey this long. I returned because every year that passed made one truth clearer than the year before." She extended the turquoise cloth a little closer. "Elias Carter, if your heart is free, I ask you to become my husband and walk beside me for whatever years the Creator allows us to share." No one spoke. The valley itself seemed to pause with her question. Elias looked from the cloth to the bracelet still resting in his own weathered hand. One had traveled 10 years across mountains. The other had quietly waited beside a lonely ranch door through every changing season. They had been separated by distance, but united by memory. He slowly reached forward, and for a brief moment everyone watching believed he was about to accept her gift. Instead, his hand stopped only inches away. His expression remained warm, yet thoughtful, carrying neither hesitation nor excitement, but something deeper. He carefully closed Iona's fingers back around the turquoise cloth before speaking in a voice so gentle that people leaned forward just to hear. "You honor me more than I deserve," he said. "But before I answer the question you have carried for 10 years, there is one answer that I must first hear from your own heart." The question lingered in the warm morning air, and for several long seconds no one dared disturb it. Iona slowly rose to her feet, still holding the folded turquoise cloth between her hands. She searched Elias's face, not with uncertainty, but with the quiet patience of someone who had already learned that the most important answers should never be rushed. Elias looked at her with the same calm respect. "Before I speak about marriage," he said softly, "I need to know something that only you can answer. If that storm had never happened, if I had never crossed that river, if I had remained nothing more than another rancher living somewhere beyond these hills, would you still have searched for me?" His words settled over the gathering like falling snow. The question surprised everyone. Several townspeople exchanged puzzled glances. They had expected gratitude, celebration, perhaps even immediate acceptance. Instead, they witnessed a man carefully separating kindness from obligation. Charles Whitmore lowered his eyes thoughtfully. Even he understood that the answer would matter far more than the proposal itself. Iona remained silent for a moment. Her gaze drifted toward the old bracelet resting in Elias's weathered hand. Then she smiled, though there was sadness mixed gently within it. "For many years," she admitted, "I believed I was searching for the man who saved my life. That is what I told everyone, including myself." She took another slow breath while the breeze lifted a loose strand of dark hair across her shoulder. "But every mile I traveled changed that story a little more. I met ranchers who spoke proudly of courage. I met traders who spoke endlessly of success. I met men with larger homes, finer horses, and more land than anyone could measure. Yet none of them reminded me of the man who stepped into a freezing river without asking whether I deserved to be rescued." Her voice never grew louder, yet every person standing nearby heard each word with perfect clarity. "I realized that I was no longer searching for the man who saved my life. I was searching for the kind of heart that made such a choice seem ordinary." A gentle murmur passed through both the Apache riders and the townspeople. An elderly woman near the church quietly wiped moisture from the corner of her eye. Benjamin Whitmore stared toward the worn porch where the lonely rancher stood dressed in faded work clothes that no wealthy man would have chosen to wear. Suddenly those clothes no longer seemed ordinary. They looked honest. Elias listened without interrupting. His expression remained thoughtful, almost burdened by the weight of her words. "Then answer me one more thing," he said. "If tomorrow every one of these gifts disappeared, if this ranch stayed poor, if all I could offer was this old house, a few acres of tired land, and an aging horse that walks slower every winter, would your answer remain the same?" Iona laughed quietly, the first truly carefree sound anyone had heard since sunrise. It was not laughter meant to dismiss his concern. It carried relief instead, as though she had finally reached the question she had hoped he would ask. She stepped closer until only a single pace separated them. Looking directly into his eyes, she gently closed his fingers around the old bracelet once more. "Elias," she whispered, "I crossed 10 years to find the man who forgot his own kindness. Do you truly believe I came here looking for his cattle?" The valley fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It no longer carried uncertainty. It carried the unmistakable feeling that every heart present had just moved one step closer to a truth none of them would ever forget. For a long moment, Elias said nothing. He simply looked at the woman who had crossed 10 years of changing seasons carrying a promise that had quietly grown into something far greater than gratitude. The breeze lifted the edges of the turquoise cloth resting in her hands, and somewhere beyond the pasture the old windmill turned with its familiar wooden rhythm, as though time itself had slowed to hear what would come next. Elias lowered his eyes to the weathered bracelet resting in his palm. The leather had faded. The turquoise bead had lost some of its shine. Yet after all these years, neither had broken. He smiled gently before closing his fingers around it one last time. Then, without warning, he placed the bracelet back into Iona's hands. A faint ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Several townspeople exchanged uneasy glances. Even a few Apache elders watched closely, uncertain whether they had just witnessed acceptance or rejection. Elias lifted his eyes and spoke with the same quiet honesty that had guided every choice of his life. "I cannot accept your answer if even one small part of your heart still believes you owe me something." The words settled softly across the valley. There was no disappointment in his voice, only kindness. 10 years ago I stepped into a river because another human being needed help. I never imagined that morning would become the reason someone shaped the next decade of her life. If you choose me because I rescued you, then I would spend every day wondering whether your love belonged to me or to a debt that should have disappeared long ago. Iona remained perfectly still. She did not interrupt. She simply listened. Elias continued, his voice almost no louder than the wind moving through the prairie grass. "Kindness is not a contract. It should never become a chain. The greatest gift you could give me is not your gratitude. It is your freedom. If your heart is truly free, then whatever choice you make afterward will be the only answer worth believing." Complete silence followed. Charles Whitmore slowly removed his spectacles and folded them into his coat pocket, unable to look away. Benjamin lowered his head, reflecting on words unlike any business lesson he had ever learned. The elderly Apache carrying the cedar chest smiled so faintly that only those nearest him noticed. Iona looked down at the bracelet resting beside the folded turquoise cloth. Tears gathered gently in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were the quiet release of a burden she had carried farther than she had ever admitted. She closed her fingers around the bracelet and drew a slow breath. Then she untied another piece of turquoise woven into the edge of her shawl and let it fall gently into the morning breeze. It drifted across the porch before settling upon the wooden floor between them. "When I left my home," she said softly, "I believed I was carrying a promise that began in a river." She looked directly into Elias's eyes, her smile warmer than the rising sun above the valley. "Now I understand that the promise began much earlier. It began the day you became the kind of man who expected nothing in return for doing what was right." She stepped one pace closer. "The debt ended years ago, Elias. I buried it somewhere between the mountains and this valley. What walked the rest of the journey was never obligation." She gently lifted the bracelet and placed it back into his hand. It was love that chose the road after gratitude had already gone home. The valley remained wrapped in silence until Elias looked once more at the bracelet resting in his hand. This time he did not see an old piece of leather weathered by 10 forgotten years. He saw a frightened young woman who had trusted a stranger, an aging chief who had believed that character could travel farther than blood, and a lonely ranch that had quietly waited for a promise neither of them fully understood. He smiled with the peaceful certainty of a man who had finally reached the end of a journey he never realized had begun. Slowly, he stepped forward and carefully tied the braided bracelet around his own wrist once again. Then he accepted the folded turquoise cloth from Iona with both hands, treating it with the same respect she had shown when offering it. "Now," he said softly, "I know your choice belongs only to you." Iona's eyes filled with quiet joy. She nodded once, unable to hide her smile any longer. It always did. There was no cheering. No celebration interrupted the stillness. The people gathered before the old ranch understood that some moments were simply too meaningful for loud voices. Charles Whitmore walked toward Elias and extended his hand. "For many years," he admitted, "I believed success was measured by the size of a ranch or the number of cattle grazing across it. Today I learned that a man's greatest wealth may be remembered by people he never expected to see again." Elias accepted the handshake with humble gratitude. Nearby, Benjamin removed his own hat and offered a respectful nod toward Iona, who returned the gesture with equal courtesy. One by one, the distance that had quietly separated neighbors for generations seemed just a little smaller than it had been that morning. The elderly Apache carrying the cedar chest approached once more and carefully placed the old journal into Elias's hands. "The chief wished you to have this if you were ever found," he said. "He believed the story no longer belonged only to our family." Elias opened the weathered cover and gently turned to the final page. Beneath the fading handwriting appeared one simple sentence: "Kindness given without expectation always finds the road home." He closed the journal slowly, holding it against his chest for a brief moment before looking across the gathered valley. Children from the town had begun wandering closer to the Apache horses, their curiosity stronger than fear. Several Apache women smiled as they showed the children colorful beadwork and woven blankets. Ranch hands helped unload baskets from wagons without being asked. Conversations that had never seemed possible quietly began beneath the warm afternoon sun. Nothing about the valley looked different, yet somehow everything had changed. Before the riders prepared to leave, Elias turned toward Iona with a gentle smile. "I believe we should walk this road together," he said. "Not because of yesterday, but because we both chose today." She slipped her hand into his, not as a reward for an old rescue, but as a promise freely given by two hearts that had finally met at the same moment in time. Side by side, they stepped away from the porch and began walking toward the open prairie while the breeze carried the scent of sage across the rolling hills. Behind them, no one hurried to follow. They simply watched in respectful silence as two distant worlds disappeared together beneath the endless western sky, leaving every witness with the quiet understanding that the strongest bridges are never built with timber or stone, but with simple acts of kindness that ask for nothing and somehow return with